Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives. I'm William J. Basanko, the Chief Operating Officer at the National Archives, and I'm pleased that you could join us, whether you're here in the theater or joining us through YouTube. Before we hear from David Margolick about his new book, The Promise and the Dream, the untold story of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, I'd like to tell you about some of our other programs taking place in this location in the near future. On Tuesday, July 17th at noon, Stuart Eisenstadt, Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to Jimmy Carter, will discuss his book, President Carter, The White House Years, where he gives us a behind-the-scenes look at how the presidency works. On Wednesday, July 18th, as part of our series of programs related to our Remembering Vietnam exhibit, and those of you that are here, we invite you upstairs to take a look at Remembering Vietnam. We will have Medal of Honor recipient Benny Adkins join us, who will discuss his book, A Tiger Among Us, a story of valor in Vietnam's A Shau Valley, where he will discuss the story of how a small group of warriors outfought and outmaneuvered their enemies and lived to tell about it, and how Adkins repeatedly risked his life to help save his fellow soldiers. Check our website or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its outreach and education programs. Pick up your application for membership in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from David Margolick about his new work, The Promise and the Dream, the untold story of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. In today's world, it is all too often incorrectly assumed that all of the holdings of the National Archives are available online. While we aim to make more and more of our holdings discoverable and usable online, the reality is that only a fraction, and a tiny fraction at that, of our holdings have been digitized. And that is what makes the efforts of authors such as David Margolick so important. The holdings of the National Archives, which document our national life, our rights, and the work of our government, contain countless untold stories that need to be discovered and told. David Margolick is a longtime contributing editor at Vanity Fair and has held similar posts at Newsweek and Portfolio. For 15 years, he was a legal affairs correspondent for the New York Times, where he covered the trials of O.J. Simpson and Lorena Bobbitt, among others, and wrote the weekly At the Bar column. His work there was nominated 4 times for the Pulitzer Prize. He's been a frequent contributor to the New York Times Book Review and the Wall Street Journal's Weekly Review section. His prior books include Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock, a story of the iconic photograph taken outside of Little Rock Central High School during the desegregation crisis of 1957. Beyond Glory, Joe Louis versus Max Schleming, and A World on the Brink, and Strange Fruit, the biography of a song. He is now working on a study of Sid Caesar and the seminal television comedy program, Your Show of Shows. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Margolick.
Thank you, Jay. You even pronounced my name correctly, which my mother appreciates. And thank you all for coming today. It's just very impressive to me to see people who are interested enough on a beautiful day in Washington to come off the mall, to come off this incredible spectacle outside the city of Washington and the epic design of Washington, and come in here and hear somebody talk about a book. I'm not sure that I'd have the dedication to do that myself, and I appreciate you're all coming here. And I also want to express my appreciation publicly Jay, as I just did privately, this book sort of started at the archives in a way. There was an opening of a photo exhibition about the life of John F. Kennedy that my colleague Larry Schiller put together just up the street. He'd worked with the archives on that, and David Ferriero, the archivist of the United States, was at that opening, and he came up to me and he said, I had just agreed to do this book, and he came up to me and said, if there's any way that I can help you, please let me know, which for some people is just kind of a pro forma thing, but not for him. And in fact, I turned to him very quickly and asked for help because there were certain collections, certain histories, oral histories at the JFK Library in Boston whose status was a little bit unclear, and they were open, but they weren't ajar. I'll put it that way. They were open, but they weren't really available, and it took a little bit of intervention just to break down the sort of bureaucratic barriers. And this was a collection of interviews that had been done for a book about Robert Kennedy's last train ride, which many of you will know about, the train that took his body from the funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral down to Union Station and then over and from there to Arlington. And there were dozens and dozens of people who were interviewed for this project. And most of whom were no longer around. And the interviews were not only about the train ride itself, but aspects of Robert Kennedy's career. And they were really very precious. And I just inscribed the book to David, and I said that he unlocked all of this history to me, and that much of the history that's in the book is really thanks to him. One wants in a book like this to be there's been a lot that's been written about Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, obviously. And for them, I see that there are some students here and younger people. It's okay for you guys to write book reports. You're still supposed to be writing book reports, but once I got out of 6th grade, I'd like to think I wrote my last book report. And no author wants to come into a book project with the idea of just rewriting what other people have done. What's the point? We all want to make our contributions to history and find these things in the archives that Jay mentioned. No matter how much has been written about somebody, there's always more. And there are always things that people haven't looked at. And the key is to know where they are and to have access to them. And so there's no way you can thank enough the people who open up things to you that no one has really looked at before. So this is my way of thanking the people at this wonderful institution. I thought I would start by reading a short portion of the book. This describes the night that Martin Luther King was killed. Back they went to room 306 of the Lorraine Motel. Could the grieving disciples of Martin Luther King Jr. have possibly chosen a grimmer spot to reconvene, the spot where he'd been murdered only a few hours earlier, where his blood still stained the cement on the balcony outside? And yet, when they left the hospital in Memphis where King had died on the evening of April 4th, 1968, what better place was there to mourn him than where he'd spent much of his last day on earth? Gathered there, with King's personal effects nearby, his small attaché case, a crumpled white shirt, a can of Hidden Magic hairspray, his Bible, a half-filled styrofoam coffee cup, a pair of glass tumblers, and the remnants of a dessert, Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, and the others grappled with the catastrophe that had just befallen them. What would now happen to their movement? Who would take King's place? What if his murder was only the first of a series that was still underway? Who among them would be next? And how could they stop the rioting that had broken out in ghettos across America, the violent antithesis of everything for which King had stood? But the same 19-inch Philco television set that beamed scenes of America aflame that night also brought some consolation from Indianapolis, where Senator Robert F. Kennedy had spoken shortly after King had been declared dead. Huddled against the cold in his big brother's old overcoat, he told the stunned and edgy crowd in the city's most dangerous neighborhood that King had just been killed, then pleaded for calm and brotherhood, reminding everyone, as if anyone could not have known, that someone he'd loved had also been killed, and also by a white man. And unlike so many of the other cities that night, Indianapolis had stayed calm. We'd wanted to get on television and tell people not to fight, not to burn down the cities, recalled Andrew Young. We were trying to get the message out to people. This is not what Dr. King would have you doing. But the press didn't want to talk to us. They were right there at the hospital, and all they wanted to do was talk about the autopsy. Or they were going around chasing the kids with the fire bombs, trying to interview them. It was almost like they were trying to provoke a riot. We were saying, look, Dr. King is gone. The important thing now is for us to keep his work going, and people are out on the streets now doing things that he wouldn't want them to do. They weren't interested in that. Bobby Kennedy's was the only voice we identified with that night. We were grateful he was out there. Kennedy's most senior advisors, the ones running his fledgling presidential campaign, had urged him to cancel the event. Doing anything political on such a night would look bad, and going into the ghetto was just too dangerous. So had the mayor of Indianapolis, Richard Lugar, a lifelong resident who'd never set foot around 17th and Broadway, where Kennedy was speaking, where a couple thousand people, nearly all of them black, had already gathered. So had the Indianapolis police. So had the customarily fearless Ethel Kennedy, who'd gone back to the hotel, praying in the back seat every minute en route. Even Kennedy might have had second thoughts. While his relationship with King had slowly improved from contentious to careful to respectful over the 8 years they'd known each other, and their causes had come increasingly to overlap, the two men had never been close. The racial and cultural divide between them had simply been too broad. They'd become allies, but never had they been friends. Why would Kennedy, of all people, subject himself to such a risk? And yet, improbably, Bobby Kennedy, a near total stranger to black America only 10 years earlier, felt more at home in it now than any other white politician in America. When the moment came, he knew instantly what he wanted and needed and had promised to do. So when, shortly after he'd landed in Indianapolis, police officials reiterated their warning, he brushed it aside. My family and I could lay down on the street there and they wouldn't bother me, he told them with a confidence bordering on bravado that would have been unimaginable from just about any other white person in America. If they would bother you, you're the one with the problem. That everyone urged him to stay away was for him only another reason to go. They were roughly the same age, Kennedy barely 3 years older. Both had larger-than-life, tyrannical fathers. Both were deeply religious. Both were charismatic. Both were ever in a hurry, for each knew about the capriciousness and brevity of life. But their differences, not just in race and class, but in geographical origins, temperament, power, and position, were much more dramatic. Given the distant poles from which they began, it's impressive, inspiring to see how closely aligned, on the issues at least, they became. At first, for both John and Robert Kennedy, King meant trouble, a distraction from things like managing the Cold War or the American economy they'd come to Washington to do. Every big demonstration or turmoil that Martin King led was a problem for the president. Robert Kennedy's key deputy at the Justice Department, Burke Marshall, later said. But as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was usually King's point of contact. That meant 3 years of tense telephone standoffs, telegram pleas for protection, stiff, formal, typewritten complaints, and occasionally compliments. At the same time, it was Robert Kennedy who had helped spring King from jail in Georgia, saved his life, or so he thought, when King huddled in the basement as an angry mob besieged a Montgomery, Alabama church, pleaded with him to halt the freedom rides, and when King refused to drop 2 aides with past communist ties, directed that his telephones be tapped. Theirs was an uneven relationship, and for King a slightly degrading one. He was the black man invariably asking for things, and Kennedy the white man doling them out, but only when his brother's political interests permitted. King was the one to say please and thank you. King was not without his powers. He'd arguably gotten John Kennedy elected, and he was the custodian of a large chunk of his legacy. And while he hectored, lectured, criticized, and exasperated Robert Kennedy, he also helped educate him. When they'd met, Kennedy had little experience with or interest in or understanding of or empathy for blacks. King helped coax out Robert Kennedy's better angels, especially with the 1963 protests in Birmingham that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The ostensibly spiritual King approached Bobby Kennedy with a hard-headedness that the pragmatic Kennedy would have admired. He had no illusions about Kennedy's instincts, which were viewed initially by the skeptical civil rights community as authoritarian, pragmatic, and not especially sympathetic. But it was Robert Kennedy with whom he knew he'd have to deal, and he'd ordered his colleagues, most notably Harry Belafonte, to go find Robert Kennedy's moral center and not return until he had. So over the last 4 years of their truncated lives, they barely saw each other, maybe only once. This was after the assassination of John Kennedy, and after Robert Kennedy had stopped being Attorney General. No longer compelled to deal with each other, they didn't. Their preoccupations and goals, ending the war in Vietnam, tackling racial discrimination in the United States, South Africa, and elsewhere, fighting poverty, increasingly overlapped. And yet, Robert Kennedy typically took care not to cozy up to King, who by now was the more radical later Martin Luther King, rather than the avuncular Martin Luther King of the March on Washington and eventually the national holiday. It might not have posed a problem in New York, but would have done him no good among white voters nationally. King's views on Vietnam, he favored immediate withdrawal, were far too extreme for Kennedy to embrace, as was his larger critique of American foreign policy and culture. Other factors kept them apart. Some thought the straight-laced Kennedy was put off by King's sexual indiscretions, minutely chronicled by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. Paradoxically, King's saintliness was also hard to take. Stylistically, Kennedy seemed to prefer the company of grittier black leaders, like the ones who'd organized the rally for him in Indianapolis. Kennedy might also have been bitter over King's sex-laced wisecracks about his late brother and his wife, overheard and recorded, and then gleefully transmitted to him by the FBI's Hoover. But guilt, too, may have been a barrier. Just how do you befriend somebody you've wiretapped? Wary is the word most frequently invoked to describe the two of them. They were friends, and they didn't even know they were friends, said John Lewis, who worked with them both. The prospect of a Kennedy-King alliance, one that was emerging as Kennedy assembled his electoral coalition, was, in his final campaign, was Harry Belafonte theorized, the right wing's greatest fear until Memphis on April 4th, 1968. What do I say, Kennedy had asked his press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, on the flight into Indianapolis that night. Should he use what his speechwriters had hastily prepared for him or go with his gut? In fact, this was often true when Kennedy asked such questions. He already knew the answer. Standing on the back of a flatbed truck at 17th and Broadway in Indianapolis, he spoke for 7 minutes. On that cold and drizzly night, little that he said on that cold and drizzly night elicited commentary afterwards. It came too late for the morning papers, And like King's equally memorable remarks the night before, his last speech, the one about having been to the mountaintop, it was lost in the enormity of the assassination. But in room 306 of the Lorraine Motel, Kennedy's words were duly noted. He was in the middle of a totally black community, and he stood there without fear and with great confidence and empathy, and he literally poured his soul out talking about his brother, Young later recalled. The amazing thing to us was that the crowd listened. He reached them. Kennedy could never replace King, but to his disciples back in the Lorraine Motel that night and throughout the black community, he had picked up his torch. In him, everyone in that room at the motel agreed, resided pretty much all of whatever hope remained. There was but one question about that torch, how long Robert Kennedy would get to hold it. I don't know. I almost feel like somebody said, "He's probably going to be next," Young later recalled. I can't remember that, but that was the feeling that many of us had. And that was all from that was from an interview that I had with Andrew Young, really almost at the very end of my research. And there's another lesson for historians and journalists and anybody writing about anything historical, that even people who've been interviewed many, many times still have things to say, new things to say. It really is a matter of what questions you ask them. I mean, Andrew Young had written his memoirs, but that story wasn't in his memoirs. You know, when you have an eventful life like Young's, you just can't get everything in your memoirs. And at the end of that, I mean, that's one of those conversations that I've had in my career and that anybody in my business has in my career, where you can't believe your good fortune, the good fortune that you have to sit on the phone or in person and actually hear somebody tell a story like that. And I thanked him afterwards, and I said, I just feel so privileged to have had this conversation with you, and thank you so much. And he said, well, I should be the one that's thanking you, because, you know, I'll never be able to tell all the stories that I have, and you're doing me a favor. You're rescuing this stuff. You're getting this stuff out of me, and you're rescuing it. And I felt pretty good about that. That was one of the high points, really, in doing a book like this. And there are many high points in when you're given a slice of history to record. It's a great privilege. It's also, of course, a great responsibility not to do it well and to do it conscientiously and to do it honestly and accurately, and not to have people find lots of mistakes in it afterwards that you have to fix if you're lucky enough to have a second edition. And it's a great responsibility to write something, a book of this kind. This book was I think that the story, I mean, what I just read, I think makes a pretty persuasive case that there was a need, and there was a need for a book like this, and a historical slot to fill. That this was a good topic, and yet there were a couple of problems. One problem was, as I say, that there had been an enormous amount written about these two guys. And, you know, though I lived through, I remember them. I was 16 when both of them were killed. I wasn't an authority on either one of them, and I had a lot of catching up to do. And how do you master the historical record of two people with, even Taylor Branch's biography of King is 2,000 pages long. I mean, you could spend all your time just reading the basic books and never getting beyond that. And as I say, and not even getting to the point where you could be original and make a contribution. That was the first problem. The second problem is that the documentary record of these two guys, for all that's been written about them, is very, very sparse. It was a lesson that I learned. This was originally supposed to have been a picture book. It was originally going to be published by National Geographic, and it was going to be a picture book. And my contribution was going to be, I describe it as grouting. You know, I mean, the pictures were going to be the building blocks, and I was going to do the masonry work around the pictures and just write a little bit. In journalistic terms, I was writing 40,000 words, which is a very short book. But, you know, again, we want our work to matter and to last, and so I got a little bit more ambitious than that, and I wrote 110,000 words. And the pictures got cut, and it became more of a book and not just a picture book, although there are still great pictures in it. But in the course of researching the photos for the book, and there are hundreds of thousands of pictures of these guys, there's really no good picture of the two of them together. And that's pretty amazing. I was really startled by that. If you look through the book, I think virtually every picture of the two of them in proximate range of one another is in there. All right. There are pictures, group pictures at the White House of the two of them together. And there's a snapshot of King with a couple of other people at the Justice Department meeting with Kennedy one day. And there are other pictures, the pictures when King testified before a Senate committee that Kennedy was on, and they're sort of hanging around in a knot of people together, and they were together when the Civil Rights Bill was signed in 1965. They're in the same room together. But there are no pictures of the two of them sort of talking intensely to one another or smiling together by themselves or shaking hands. Now, why is that? That's not an accident. Why? Somebody didn't want pictures of these two guys taken, all right? I don't think it was King, for the reason that I suggested in the introduction. I mean, Bobby Kennedy was King's main man in the Kennedy administration. He was the man to whom King had to turn whenever he wanted anything. He wanted to maximize his connections to Robert Kennedy. But as I suggested, King posed perils to the Kennedys. King was a dangerous man. The Kennedys were politicians first. And what do politicians think about? Politicians think about survival before anything else. You have to survive in order to do anything. And so the first thing to do is to stay in office and not irk people, not anger people. And King was a dangerous man. King was a dangerous man in the South. It's hard to believe a time when the Democratic Party still had a chance to win in the South, but back then it did. And tying himself too explicitly to King endangered Democratic votes in states like Georgia, and the Kennedys didn't want to do that. So the Kennedys kept their distance from King, and so the documentary record, not just the photographic record, is skimpy. There aren't a lot of letters between the two of them. There are a few phone calls. I mean, there were phone calls, but most of them were not recorded. There are only a couple of transcripts of phone calls. They never visited one another. Kennedy had various black leaders to Hickory Hill, his house in Virginia, like Harry Belafonte and James Baldwin, but he never invited King there. I mean, one of the striking things that I learned in the course of the book was that even after Kennedy gave the speech in Indianapolis, first of all, the speech in Indianapolis that night, which I'm sure many of you have seen many times on video and in documentaries. I mean, it's really among the most famous footage of Robert Kennedy and surely his greatest speech. That was the only time, really, he spoke explicitly and publicly about Martin Luther King. So really, when it comes right down to it, the only moment when he felt free to embrace Martin Luther King was after Martin Luther King had died. And even then, it was a fleeting moment. Kennedy gave one more speech the next day before the campaign was paused for King's funeral for several days. And Kennedy spoke about violence in America and gave a very powerful speech the next day in Cleveland before the campaign was adjourned. And how do you talk about violence the night after Martin Luther King has been murdered and not mention Martin Luther King in the speech? But he didn't. And he really didn't mention King for the rest of the campaign, which was, again, truncated only 2 more months. So as I say, the material on the two of them, the direct encounters between the two of them are limited. And this was why, in one of the early interviews that I did for the book, was with Robert Kennedy's eldest daughter, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who many of you will know. And she was perfectly courteous. She didn't have to meet with me. I mean, the Kennedys get lots of interview requests. She was totally courteous with me. But she was also very blunt, and she said, "You don't have a book here. There's no book." She said, the mere fact that, these two guys rubbed up against each other a little bit, that doesn't mean that they had a relationship, and if they didn't have a relationship, they didn't have a book. And I didn't have a book. And, I tried not to be discouraged by that, and I think that, I guess my feeling was that anybody who could give a speech, I mean, the mere existence of that Indianapolis speech binds these two men together so profoundly that you have to work backwards from that and look into the corners and crevices of history. You knew that they were acutely aware of one another. They were following one another. They were working on parallel courses with one another at the end. They were fencing and struggling and manipulating one another before that. Their lives were very profoundly intertwined. And so the book would consist really of explaining all of these subtle and important ways in which they were really the most important white-black partnership, I think, in the history of the civil rights movement. I can't think of another that's more important. Surely there's a book about that. And then part of the book has to be why, a historian's task or a journalist. I never know whether to call myself a historian or a journalist. I'm somewhere in, historian sounds too highfalutin, but journalist is not quite accurate. I'm somewhere in between. But part of our task is to explain the gaps in the historical record. Why doesn't something exist? And that was part of my job too. So I think that, and then when you learn things like, Andrew Young's account of that night at the hotel, at the Lorraine Motel, and you juxtapose that with the speech in Indianapolis and the fact that Kennedy wiretapped Martin Luther King, and the fact that Kennedy's dramatic evolution from having worked for Senator Joe McCarthy and being an early sort of I won't say a skeptic of the civil rights movement, but quite indifferent to the civil rights movement. You have this dramatic evolution in Robert Kennedy's life to the point where at the very end, Martin Luther King, who never endorsed anyone, was prepared to endorse him for the presidency. So you have a dramatic evolution between the two and kind of a shadowy but substantive relationship between the two. There's a book. And as I said, I was supposed to write 40,000 words, and I wrote 3 times as many. I feel as if I filled an important gap in the historical record, and in elucidating how these two men overlapped and felt about each other, and what they achieved together and what they might have achieved. How do you do that? You do that by, as I say, coming to the archives and looking where nobody else has ever looked, reading interviews that nobody else has ever read, reading interviews with people who are gone and no longer can speak for themselves. You look at newspapers. I was as Jay said, I was a reporter on the New York Times for 15 years. And I feel very loyal to the New York Times, but the New York Times has sort of an unfair stranglehold on history because it's the easiest paper to research, and it's scanned and it's available everywhere and it's indexed, but there are lots of other papers that covered these guys and that aren't consulted, that aren't as easily accessible and aren't consulted as much because writers often take the path of least resistance. It requires a little bit of imagination to look in other places. For instance, the black press, which had a lot of coverage of the Kennedys and the Kennedy administration. And it's interesting that the black leadership, people like King, were very dissatisfied with John and Robert Kennedy, whom they felt were moving far too slowly on civil rights. But the black press loved the Kennedys, and there are wonderful stories in there. I mean, there was one night when for the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a gathering at the White House. And there were hundreds and hundreds of black guests at the White House that night, black entertainers, black athletes, black politicians, civil rights people. And that had never happened before. I mean, some of you will know that, it was a major event when Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to the White House to have a black man, who wasn't a servant in the White House actually meet the President of the United States. Was a major event. And here was the black community coming en masse to the White House, and this was the kind of thing that was that played very well in the black press. And so when John F. Kennedy was killed, the eulogies in Ebony and Jet and the black papers are quite extraordinary, and this partly explains the great affection with which Robert Kennedy was held. I mean, he'd done very little to justify it in a way until his brother was killed. And then, I mean, in a way, that's really not quite fair, but there was this great outpouring of affection for John Kennedy in the black community after he was murdered that Robert Kennedy inherited. And the event had a transformative effect, obviously, on his life. It was after the assassination that he went to South Africa, that he went to the Mississippi Delta and saw poverty firsthand, that he got to the extraordinary point where, as I mentioned, where he felt more at home in the ghetto, really, than he did anywhere else. And he was received with such adulation and could say, I mean, you can't help but think about the present president talking about, how he could, somebody could shoot him in Fifth Avenue or whatever he said about that. When I read that quote from Robert Kennedy saying, I could lie down in the middle of the ghetto in Indianapolis with my family and no one would bother me. I mean, what an extraordinary thing to say. How could he have felt so confident about that? And yet it was true. I mean, that was the feeling. That was the feeling of incredible affection that he generated in that community. Really quite an amazing thing. So you look at documents, you look at newspapers that no one had read before, and then you talk to the eyewitnesses. And this is another mission that we have as journalists / historians. I've often felt this when Jay was reading the titles of the books that I've done. They're cases of triage in a way. They're rescue missions. They're attempts to get to people before they die. Really, that's what you have to do. I forget who it was who says that when a person dies, a library dies, and it's true. And these people that I was privileged enough to interview, like Andrew Young, like John Lewis, like Harry Belafonte, like Clarence Jones, who was Martin Luther King's lawyer. And then people on the Robert Kennedy side, Peter Edelman, one of his speechwriters, Marion Wright Edelman, one of the few people who sort of was a liaison between King and Kennedy, one of the few people who actually moved between the two of them and knew the two of them and sort of was a back channel between the two of them. There were Bobby Kennedy's chief speechwriter, Adam Walensky. I interviewed him. These are people you could turn to them and in one sentence and learn more than you could learn from reading lots of books, because they were there and they just, they can talk turkey with you. They just know the truth. I mean, for instance, one theory about why Robert Kennedy tapped Martin Luther King's phone, there was a theory that it was really, it was benign. It was really to protect King. That King it was to vindicate King. The FBI was saying that King was surrounded by communists And Bobby Kennedy wanted to clear the record up and prove, you know, if you wiretapped him and there were no communications with communists, I mean, it would prove once and for all that King was not a communist, as he was repeatedly labeled. So he really did it as a favor to Martin Luther King. And, you know, one conversation with Martin Luther King's lawyer, who said, that's a fantasy. You know, that's all that you need. I mean, it refutes all of the speculation later on about the explanation for the wiretap. And there's no substitute for that kind of contemporaneous comment from an eyewitness. One of the great dangers in writing a book like this, or writing a book on this subject, and I'm sure that some of you have witnessed some of this in the last couple of months as the commemorations were held, is canonization. You know, there are lots of people who sort of feel they elevate themselves by writing about a saintly person. And it's in their interest to sort of airbrush out all of the inconvenient facts about somebody. For instance, that Robert Kennedy's record on civil rights was not a good one before he was Attorney General. You know, that Martin Luther King was horrified at the thought that Robert Kennedy was going to determine the direction of the civil rights movement. And, you know, King had his own peccadillos, as we know. And these are all in there. I mean, somebody said, I gave a reading last night, and somebody said that, you know, in the first 60 pages, he felt a little bit disillusioned with Robert Kennedy. It wasn't that I took any joy in putting these things in there. In fact, I felt that it was part of the historical record, and that the very journey that Robert Kennedy took, I think Kennedy's journey was longer than King's, the very journey that he took and the very sort of retrograde position from which he started makes him an even greater figure. You don't need to write a hagiography. You don't need to turn the man into a saint. The more real he is, the more heroic he is, and that goes for both of them. So anyway, it was a privilege to write about, to be given this slice of history to write about, and it all started here at the archives, and it's sort of ending here at the archives, and I find that fitting, and it's a great honor for me, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming and listening to this. And I'm happy to take questions with the proviso that you go to the microphone to ask them. Thank you. Somebody's got to be the first. Now, good.
Yeah, I'll start it off.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could add in Lyndon Johnson to the mix in regards to, you mentioned Martin Luther King wanting a strategic relationship with the Kennedys, when John F. Kennedy, obviously, and Robert Kennedy were there, and then obviously that was different after the fact, and how that dynamic changed with Lyndon Johnson becoming president and Robert Kennedy being in a position where, was he a stronger position for Martin Luther King then versus King's position at that stage in history directly with Lyndon Johnson? If there's anything you can talk about that.
Well, I think that, you know, I'm not an authority on this. I'm no Robert Caro on this, and I had to be rather strategic about my research here because this book was written in less than a year. So I didn't go very far down that path. I think that Robert Kennedy faded in importance to Martin Luther King after John Kennedy was shot. And they had really very, very little to do with one another until 1968 when Bobby ran for president. Johnson, correspondingly, of course, because he became president, was much more important to King. And I think that King had a better relationship with Johnson initially than he had with John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy. He understood him. And Johnson was a Southerner. And Johnson was intent on burnishing his record and making his record in civil rights and sort of proving to the world that he wasn't a racist and that he had overcome his own origins. And so I think that even I think I think it's in the book, after Kennedy was shot, after John Kennedy was shot, I think that King says to Coretta, you know, this might not be so bad for us. You know, Johnson sort of gets it. And I think he felt that he had more of a friend in the White House when Johnson was there. The flip side of that is that Johnson was much more volatile, and Johnson was more insecure, and Johnson felt more easily betrayed. And so when King came out against the war in Vietnam, he was on Johnson's enemies list. And there was very little, and Johnson was talking to Hoover, and Johnson, I mean, he was persona non grata with Lyndon Johnson. So he lived and died by that same sword. I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much for, I think we all appreciate your discussion of putting the book together and to encourage future historians to come here.
Yeah,
and to,
no, that's great. Just, you know, it's great.
Yes, and to struggle through all the process of...
And to tell the truth and
yes.
and to try to say something new and not muzzle yourself to, you know, to placate certain people or curry favor or whatever, and just write up whatever you find.
Mm-hmm. My question is on faith. Bobby Kennedy being a Catholic and Martin Luther King being a Baptist, and their faiths playing such a strong role in their lives. Could you discuss how they respected one another with their different faiths, what they shared in common? Could you elaborate more on
You know,
how their faith drove them?
Yeah, I think that was
being the people that they were.
Yeah, you're right about that. They were both very religious. I don't think it was a great bond between them. I think it was one thing that they shared, but they had different religious traditions. And I saw no sign that they ever bonded over their belief in God, whatever they shared. They shared, I mean, their religions were also part of their culture. You know, the Catholic culture and the Baptist culture, and they were very, very different. And everybody always stressed to me, all of the people, again, you had to go back to the people who knew them, because I was desperate to find connections between these guys. That was the premise of the book. So this was something, I mean, that was an obvious connection that I wanted to explore. And whenever I did explore it, people sort of the people who knew them kind of shot me down. All right? And they would say they had fundamentally different temperaments. It didn't matter that they both went to church. They had fundamentally different temperaments. King was a spiritual man and Kennedy was a politician. And so I don't think it was that much of a bond. I don't think that it brought them together. I saw very little sign that they appreciated one another more because of it. And as somebody said, I think that Kennedy found King to be a stuffed shirt, sort of, uptight. And of course, when King was with Kennedy, he was uptight. I just watched a video upstairs of King on a television interview in the exhibition upstairs. And there's a Southern reporter asking him repeatedly about, do you support, how far does your support for civil rights go? And, does it extend to private businesses? And if somebody wants to exclude somebody from a private business, why shouldn't he be able to? Isn't that his right? And what if letting blacks into his business turns off all of his white clientele, his white customers, and he loses his business? What kind of risk? The guy was baiting him, okay? And there was King sitting there very politely and fielding his questions, and he always had to behave himself. His behavior always had to be impeccable, It's the reason why I had this idea in the book. You know, Kennedy gave this famous speech the night the King was killed. What would King have said the night Kennedy was killed? You know, how different would his speech have been had he been around to give it? And my theory is that he wouldn't have given nearly as good a speech because he would have had to keep it within certain parameters. You know, he'd have to be entirely proper. That was the role that he played. His behavior had to be beyond reproach all the time. And I think that Kennedy found him stuffy. That's my impression. I don't have any direct evidence of that, which is why I think he was a little bit uncomfortable with him. Of course, King had a great sense of humor, but only when he was with people he was comfortable with, and he wasn't comfortable with the Kennedys. And I think that King, as I said in the introduction, that Kennedy found King overly saintly, you know, and couldn't really mix it up with him, which is why he preferred to meet with other kinds of black leaders rather than with King. I don't think he ever felt comfortable with him, and I think that was so the religion, that trumped the religion in a way. That trumped whatever, their piety. And I think that, you know, I'm not an authority on the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism and black baptism in particular. But there's, you know, they're as different as the church services are. You know, I mean, what could be more different? And so my impression is that it was not a great bond between them.
Hi. Just on the point about sanctifying people after they've died and so on, do you think, in the case of King, that there is now too much of treating him as a sort of cuddly figure with a universal message and sort of quoting one line from the March on Washington speech, and that now too much is forgotten about his more radical edge and his more sort of troublemaking edge? Has that process happened? For example, I sometimes hear it said that there are these corporate Martin Luther King breakfasts that try to make everybody feel better and tend to sort of overlook his more radical side.
Yeah, I think that you've, in a way, your question is an excellent one, but I think that you've almost answered it yourself. I think that you need to read the Riverside speech that King gave and some other speeches that he gave at the end of his life, near the end of his life. That was a year before he died, to realize how radicalized he'd become, and he'd become sort of a radical socialist. And if you read the Riverside speech, he's basically challenging American capitalism, and he's saying that Americans are despoiling the world and taking Americans are colonialists, and Americans are running amok throughout the world, and America is a malign influence in the world, not just in Vietnam. And it's a radical speech. And this is, I'm convinced, there were a couple of instances where Kennedy and King exchanged notes after speeches they gave. I think that King wrote Kennedy a note after Kennedy spoke in the Mississippi Delta. But Kennedy didn't write King a note after the Riverside speech. It was a reminder that King was radioactive, and that Kennedy had to keep his distance from him. And so, yes, you know, I mean, I think that white America has sort of frozen King at the March on Washington, and that's the end of the King story, and doesn't really want to concentrate very much on the Martin Luther King that emerged after that. I mean, he's a very embattled figure because he's getting it from all directions. You know, he's getting it from whites, he's getting it from black moderates, he's getting it from black radicals. People think that he's overstepped his boundaries by opining on the war in Vietnam. He was profoundly depressed at the criticism that he was getting. His friends thought that he was suicidal. There was a really good the HBO documentary called King in the Wilderness, you know, about his last few years, is excellent in this regard because it really illustrates that part of the story. And I think it's it's a conveniently forgotten part of the story, but it's a crucial part of his story. One more? We're out of time. We're out of time. Oh, okay. Well, thank you all again.
Folks, just a reminder, there is a book